Listen to me, young girl. If you try to take that child's life again, you will die. Mark my words." The old woman's voice echoed through the trees. Without another word, she turned and hobbled away. Sanam sat quietly under the tall mango tree in her schoolyard. It was lunchtime, but she wasn't hungry. Her mind was far away, tangled with fears and worries. At just 18 years old, she had discovered she was pregnant, a secret she shared only with her boyfriend, Okubi. They had been dating for nearly a year, a sweet love story that began with shy glances and shared laughter at the back of their classroom. Both Sanam and Okubi came from very poor homes. Their parents had struggled to keep them in school, sacrificing meals and basic needs so their children could have a better future. They were now only a few months away from their final exams, the last step to securing a life beyond poverty. But this pregnancy had turned their dreams upside down. One evening after school, Sanam met Okubi behind their usual spot near the broken fence. The setting sun cast an orange glow on Okubi's troubled face. "Sanam," he began, his voice low and hesitant. "You know we can't keep this baby." Sanam looked at him, her eyes wide. "What do you mean?" "We'll drop out of school, Sanam. My parents will throw me out, and your mother—" Okubi paused, unsure how to finish. Sanam's heart sank. Deep down, she knew he was right. Their parents would never understand. Tears welled up in her eyes. "So, what do we do?" Okubi exhaled deeply. "We'll get rid of it, just until we can finish school. It's for our future." The word abort hung heavy in the air, but neither of them dared say it aloud. For days, they discussed the matter in hushed whispers. They wanted to go to a doctor, but the reality of their poverty made that impossible. A trip to the clinic cost more money than either of them had ever seen. Then, one afternoon, Sanam remembered stories of herbal concoctions, old remedies that women whispered about in villages to deal with problems like hers. She brought it up with Okubi. "Do you think it will work?" he asked skeptically. "We don't have a choice," Sanam replied. "I heard about some herbs we can mix." The following weeks were filled with desperation. They gathered leaves and roots, brewed them into bitter teas, and Sanam forced herself to drink the foul mixtures. Day after day she waited, hoping for something to happen, hoping to erase her mistake. But nothing changed. The baby was still there, growing inside her. One morning on her way to school, Sanam took a shortcut through the bush path. She walked briskly, her mind clouded with worry. Suddenly, she heard a raspy voice behind her. "Schoolgirl!" Sanam froze. Turning slowly, she saw an old woman leaning on a crooked walking stick. Her face was wrinkled, her eyes sharp and knowing. "Come here," the old woman said, pointing a bony finger. Sanam hesitated but stepped closer. The woman's gaze pierced through her. "You are pregnant," she said, her voice calm yet firm. "And you want to kill the innocent child." Sanam's breath caught in her throat. She stammered. "Listen to me, young girl. If you try to take that child's life again, you will die. Mark my words." The old woman's voice echoed through the trees. Without another word, she turned and hobbled away, leaving Sanam rooted to the ground, trembling with fear. That night, Sanam couldn't sleep. The woman's words replayed in her mind. What if it was true? What if trying again would kill her? Early the next morning, she rushed to find Okubi, her hands shaking. "Okubi," she said, her voice breaking. "I can't do it anymore. I can't." He looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" "The abortion. We can't keep trying. I met someone, an old woman. She said I will die if I abort this baby. I'm scared, Okubi. I want to keep it." Okubi stared at her for a long moment, his face pale. He didn't know whether to argue or agree, but deep inside, he was scared too. Senam sat on the edge of her small bed, her eyes swollen from crying. The room was dimly lit, and the air felt heavy. Okubi's words still echoed painfully in her ears. "I'm not ready for a child, Senam," he had said just a few days earlier. His voice was cold, a tone she had never heard before. "If you decide to keep it, then I have no hand in it. Don't come looking for me." Senam had stared at him, shocked. The boy she thought loved her, her best friend, her partner in everything, was walking away. Her heart shattered into pieces. Soon word spread like wildfire through their small town. It didn't take long for Senam's mother to hear about her daughter's pregnancy. One morning, she stormed into Okubi's home, her voice sharp with rage. "Okubi, come out here!" she yelled, her face contorted with anger. Okubi's parents emerged from their small, crumbling house, confused by the commotion. When Okubi finally appeared, his face betrayed no emotion. "Is it true?" his father asked him quietly. "Is Senam pregnant with your child?" Okubi didn't flinch. "I don't know what she's talking about. I have nothing to do with her." Senam's mother gasped, her hand clutching her chest. "You're lying!" she screamed, pointing at him. "You two have been together for months, and now you want to deny her. May the gods judge you." But Okubi stood firm, his gaze distant. Senam's mother left humiliated, her anger now turning to her daughter. When Senam returned home that evening, her mother was waiting. "Foolish girl!" she shouted, her voice trembling with fury. "You've disgraced me, carrying a child whose father won't even acknowledge you. Do you know the shame you've brought upon this house?" Senam tried to explain, tears streaming down her face, but her mother would not listen. "From today," she said coldly, "you're on your own. Don't expect me to feed you, clothe you, or care for you. You've made your bed. Lie in it." The days that followed were a nightmare. Senam's mother stopped taking care of her completely. She was left to fend for herself, often going to bed hungry, her stomach growling in protest. She could feel the child inside her growing weaker with every passing day. Poor nutrition and the lack of proper antenatal care made her pregnancy even harder. Despite her pain, Senam refused to drop out of school. Every morning she put on her worn-out uniform, hid her growing belly beneath her oversized skirt, and walked the dusty road to school. Okubi was in the same class as her, but he acted as though she didn't exist. He never looked her way, never spoke to her, as if all their memories had been erased. The boy who once held her hand now walked past her without a glance. Her mother's rejection and Okubi's denial left Senam with no choice but to take up menial jobs after school. She washed clothes for neighbors, fetched water for small tips, and swept compound houses just to earn a little money for food. Every evening she sat by candlelight, studying through her exhaustion, determined not to give up on her dreams. Some days she would feel her strength failing. The burden of school, work, and her pregnancy seemed impossible to bear. But she remembered an old Akan proverb her grandmother once told her: "A stubborn child who refuses to listen will hit their head against a tree." Senam whispered it to herself, knowing its meaning. Mistakes come with consequences, but the strength to overcome them comes from within. There were days she questioned everything. Why had this happened to her? Why had the boy she loved turned his back on her? Why had her mother abandoned her when she needed her the most? But deep inside, she clung to hope. Months passed, and Senam grew heavier with her child. Her classmates whispered behind her back, and teachers gave her pitiful looks. But she refused to give up. She carried her books to class, sat through lessons, and endured the whispers. The hardest moments were when she saw Okubi laughing with his friends. He seemed free, untouched by the weight that crushed her every day. But Senam swallowed her pain. She promised herself that no matter how hard it got, she would survive. She would finish school, take care of her baby, and prove to herself and the world that she was not defeated. Her path was lonely and painful, but in the stillness of the night, as she rubbed her growing belly, she whispered to the child within her, "You are not a mistake. You are my strength. We will make it together." In that moment, Senam realized that though she had been abandoned by others, she had not abandoned herself, and that was enough to keep her going. Against all odds, Senam completed her senior secondary school education while heavily pregnant. Each day was a challenge, waking up at dawn to study, attending school with swollen feet, and enduring the stares of her classmates and teachers. The whispers never stopped, but Senam hardened herself to the judgment. She knew she was fighting for something bigger than herself, her unborn child's future. When the final exams ended, Senam exhaled deeply for the first time in months. Yet there was no time to celebrate. Her battle was far from over. With no family support and no one to lean on, she had to continue working menial jobs to prepare for her baby's arrival. Every coin she earned went toward baby care items. Small things like a second-hand blanket, a pair of old socks, or a plastic feeding bottle. Each purchase came with tears, for she knew how much sacrifice each cent represented. There was no one to gift her anything, no baby showers, no celebrations. 9 months later, on a rainy afternoon, Senam gave birth to a baby boy. It was not in a hospital, as she couldn't afford it, but in the small room she shared with her mother, who refused to help. An older neighbor, moved by Senam's plight, helped her through the delivery. The cries of the newborn echoed through the compound, but there was no joy, no cheers, only Senam's quiet sobs of exhaustion and uncertainty. The baby was weak and small. His limbs trembled slightly, and his breathing was shallow. The failed abortion attempts had left scars on his fragile body. A few weeks later, the neighbor noticed something was wrong. The baby coughed often, and his tiny chest seemed to struggle with each breath. "He's showing signs of pneumonia," the neighbor said softly. "It's common in babies who are born weak, but it can be treated with antibiotics." Senam's heart froze. Pneumonia, a treatable condition, yet it felt like a death sentence. She had no money for a doctor, let alone medication. She spent sleepless nights rocking her baby in her arms, whispering prayers and begging him to hold on. The baby's cries grew louder, sharper, piercing Senam's soul. Each time the little boy coughed, Senam felt a knife twist inside her. She watched her baby suffer, her tiny body racked with pain, and there was nothing she could do. The burden of helplessness weighed heavily on her. The baby's condition worsened as days passed. Senam tried everything. She worked longer hours washing clothes for neighbors, skipped meals to save money, and even pleaded with local herbal sellers for remedies. But nothing worked. With no family support and no money for proper treatment, Senam felt herself breaking. One evening, as the baby whimpered weakly in her arms, she sat by the doorway and stared into the darkening sky. Tears streamed down her face. "Maybe it's better if—" she whispered to herself, but couldn't finish the sentence. The thought of giving up on the baby haunted her, but she was overwhelmed by hopelessness. Her mother still refused to look at her, let alone the baby. Okubi had disappeared from her life completely. She was alone, a young girl with a sick child and no one to turn to. That night, as her baby cried faintly, Senam held her close and whispered through her tears, "I'm sorry. I don't know what else to do." Her heart ached. It wasn't the life she had imagined for herself or her child, but it was the one she had been dealt. The Akan proverb she had once heard came back to her. A child who refuses to heed advice will burn their mouth with hot food. Senam blinked back fresh tears, stood up, and carried him to the small, dimly lit bathroom. She placed him gently on the floor, knelt beside him, and watched him closely. His little chest rose and fell with difficulty, and his faint cries were heartbreaking. "My baby," she said softly, her voice shaking as her tears dropped onto his tiny body. "I love you. I love you more than anything in this world. But I can't watch you die in my hands. I have nothing to give you. No medicine, no food, no warmth. I don't know what else to do." Her voice cracked as she continued, "I'm going to take a decision tonight. One that might save your life, or take it. If you are not a lucky child, this might be the end. But if the gods see your innocence, maybe someone will save you." She paused and stared into the distance, her heart burning with anguish. Suddenly, as though a dark force overtook her, she whispered with rage, "But before that, before I let this go, I must curse your father." Senam stood up slowly. She removed her clothes one by one until she was completely naked. Tradition had taught her that curses were strongest when spoken in one's purest form. She sat on the cold, wet ground of the bathroom, her tears mingling with the dust. "Okubi," she began, her voice rising with bitterness and pain. "As you have abandoned your child, so shall children abandon you. The way you denied your own blood, may the gods deny you peace. You will never know the joy of children, and even if you do, they will leave you to suffer, just as you have left me and this innocent baby." Her voice trembled, growing louder and more forceful. "May you feel this pain 10 times over, Okubi. May your heart ache the way mine does tonight." Senam's cries filled the small bathroom as her body shook with anger and sorrow. The baby whimpered on the cold ground beside her. The walls seemed to absorb her pain, as though they too were mourning her hopelessness. At dawn, with red, swollen eyes and a heavy heart, Senam swaddled her baby boy in an old cloth. The night's curses had drained her, but the decision had been made. She could no longer watch her child suffer and die in her arms. If she stayed in the village, both of them would perish. Of that, she was certain. She gathered the few coins she'd saved and quietly left the house. The air was cold and still as she walked to the main road. Her baby's faint cries were the only sounds breaking the silence. When she saw the first trotro approaching, she waved it down and climbed in, clutching her child tightly. As the car rumbled away from the village, Senam looked out of the window, the tears she had tried to hold back finally falling again. Her thoughts churned with guilt and grief. "Maybe this is the only way," she whispered to herself, staring at her baby boy's peaceful face. "I have been abandoned by everyone. My mother, Okubi, the world. I can't save you, my child. I have nothing left to give. But maybe, just maybe, if I leave you somewhere, Someone will find you. Someone will take care of you, and you will live. The thought made her shiver. Could she really abandon her own child? The very baby she had fought so hard to protect. Yet, as she looked at his frail body, she felt her heart shatter all over again. "It's better this way," she whispered. "Maybe the gods will send you an angel." The trotro continued down the dusty road, the rising sun casting a faint light on a young mother who had reached the edge of desperation, carrying a child whose cries echoed her silent plea for mercy. Senam alighted from the rickety trotro with her baby boy in her arms. The bustling streets of East Legon were a world she had only seen on television. The luxury, the cars, the towering mansions. It felt like a different Ghana altogether. She walked aimlessly through the neighborhood, her heart heavy with grief and hope intertwined. As the sun began to set, Senam found a quiet corner to sit and wait for nightfall. Her baby stirred weakly in her arms, his cries now faint and infrequent. She kissed his forehead, whispering softly, "My boy, my precious boy, I'm sorry." When the sky turned dark and the streets were quiet, she stood up, clutching her baby tightly. She walked toward one of the grand mansions, its gates tall and imposing. She had no plan, only desperation. She knelt at the gate, looking at her baby one last time. With trembling hands, she carefully placed him on a folded cloth in front of the gate. She traced the small mark she'd made on his back earlier that evening, a tiny line with charcoal, her way of ensuring she would recognize him if fate ever brought them together again. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she whispered a short, desperate prayer. "God of the helpless, if you exist, please save my child. Give him a life I could not. Let him find love and care in this world. My son, forgive me for leaving you. I pray you grow to be strong and happy." She wiped her tears, took a deep breath, and looked at the house number. She repeated it to herself over and over, then turned and walked away into the darkness. The baby's faint cries echoed through the silent East Legon neighborhood. The child was fading fast, his small body too weak to fight much longer. Hours passed, and still no one came. The cries grew weaker, the night colder. At around 2:40 a.m., Mr. Abuaji, the wealthy owner of the mansion, woke up to a strange sound. He grabbed his phone and checked the CCTV cameras at the front gate. His heart skipped a beat when he saw a bundle lying on the ground, faintly moving.
"Agnes!" he called out to his wife. "There's a baby at the gate! Hurry!"
The two rushed outside, their slippers slapping against the tiled floors. When they reached the gate, they saw the baby lying there, barely breathing. His tiny cries were almost inaudible. "Oh my God!" Mrs. Abuaji whispered, picking him up carefully. "He's so sick! We have to do something!" They wrapped the baby in a soft blanket and drove him to the East Legon police station. The officers there knew the Abuajes well. Mr. Abuaje was a respected businessman in the community. "We found this baby outside our gate," Mr. Abuaje explained, his voice trembling. "He's very sick. We're taking him to the hospital, but we wanted to report it first." The police officers examined the child and nodded sympathetically. One of them said, "You've done well to bring him here. We'll log the details and make a public announcement to find the parents. But for now, take him to the hospital. This child doesn't look like he has much time left." The Abuajes left their contact information and rushed to a private hospital nearby. At the hospital, the doctors immediately took the baby into intensive care. After several tense hours, a pediatrician approached the couple. "This baby "Is lucky you brought him when you did," the doctor said gravely. "He wouldn't have survived the night. He's severely malnourished and has untreated pneumonia. We'll do everything we can, but it will take time and resources to stabilize him." "Do whatever it takes," Mr. Aboagye said firmly. "Money is not an issue. Just save him." The next few days were a whirlwind of tests, treatments, and sleepless nights. The Aboagyes stayed by the baby's side, watching as his tiny body fought for survival. Slowly but surely, he began to respond to treatment. As they watched him breathe more steadily, tears filled Mrs. Aboagye's eyes. "He's such a strong little boy," she whispered. "It's a miracle he survived." The Aboagyes didn't know who had left the child at their gate or why, but they felt a deep connection to him, a sense of responsibility and love that grew stronger with each passing day. Unbeknownst to them, the mother who had left him behind was wandering the streets of Accra, praying that her son was safe and that her decision to abandon him would lead to a better life than she could give. The baby boy spent nearly a month in the private hospital, clinging to life. The Aboagye family spared no expense, pouring their resources into saving him. The doctors marveled at the boy's resilience, calling it a miracle that he survived such a severe case of malnutrition and pneumonia. Mr. and Mrs. Aboagye visited him every day, watching him grow stronger with each passing week. The hospital bills were enormous, but to them, no amount of money could compare to the joy of seeing the child thrive. When the day finally came to bring the boy home, the Aboagyes were overjoyed. Despite multiple announcements and investigations, there were no traces of his biological parents. It was as though he had been delivered to them by the heavens. "We'll take him as our own," Mrs. Aboagye said one evening, holding the boy close. "He's the child we prayed for all these years. He's God's gift to us." They named him Aboagye Nyamichire, which means God's gift. The Aboagye family poured their hearts into raising Nyamechir. After years of marriage without a child, he became their everything, their hope, their happiness, and their comfort. They doted on him, ensuring he never lacked anything. By the time Nyamechir turned 5, he was attending one of the best schools in East Legon, where the fees were paid in dollars. He wore the finest clothes, traveled in a chauffeur-driven car, and grew up surrounded by love and opportunity. The Aboagye's home, once quiet and somber, now echoed with the sounds of laughter and play. For them, Nyamechir was a reminder that even in life's darkest moments, blessings could emerge. 25 years later, life had taken a very different turn for Okubi. He had become a wealthy man, a successful importer of goods, known across the country for his thriving business. His house was grand, his cars luxurious, and his bank account overflowing. On the surface, he had everything a man could wish for, except for happiness. Despite his wealth and status, Okubi lived a lonely and unfulfilled life. He had no wife, no children, and no one to share his success with. He had tried multiple relationships and even marriage, but none lasted more than 2 years. At first, his lack of children seemed like a minor issue, something that could be addressed with time. But as the years passed, it became clear that no matter how many women he married or how many doctors he visited, he could not father a child. "There's nothing wrong with you physically," one doctor had told him after a series of tests. "You're perfectly healthy. It's unexplainable." His inability to have children weighed heavily on him. Each time a relationship ended, he would hear the same painful words. "You're a good man, Okubi, but I need a family." I'm sorry, but I can't stay in a marriage with no future for children. These rejections left him bitter and lonely. His once confident demeanor gave way to frustration and self-doubt. The irony was not lost on him. He had everything money could buy, but the one thing he desired most, a child of his own, remained out of reach. Each failed relationship felt like a curse hanging over his life, and in his quiet moments, he often wondered if this was his punishment. After abandoning her baby at the mansion in East Legon, Senam's life spiraled further into hardship. The weight of her decisions, coupled with rejection and loneliness, left her broken. She had hoped leaving her child in a wealthy neighborhood would give him a better life, but it came at a great personal cost. She couldn't continue her education and had to resort to selling basic items on the streets of Accra, standing in the scorching sun for hours just to make ends meet. Years passed, but life in the city did not improve. Exhausted and defeated, Senam decided to return to her village, carrying with her the weight of failure. When she arrived, her face gaunt and weary, her family welcomed her with cautious indifference. They were curious about the fate of her child, but hesitant to ask. Finally, one evening, Senam gathered the courage to speak. "The child, he didn't survive," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the ground. "His health kept failing, and I couldn't save him in Accra." Her family listened, their faces devoid of shock or grief. Deep down, they had always believed the boy wouldn't survive, given his weak start in life. No one mourned openly. Instead, they continued their lives, leaving Senam to grapple with her sorrow alone. Far away in a different part of the country, Okubi sat in his luxurious home, haunted by memories of his past. As a successful businessman, he had achieved everything he once dreamed of: wealth, status, and power. Yet a deep emptiness gnawed at him. One quiet evening, as he sat alone in his spacious living room, his mind wandered back to his youth. He remembered Senam, his first love, and the pregnancy he had coldly denied all those years ago. He had spent decades trying to bury the memory, but it refused to stay hidden. The guilt and curiosity became unbearable. "I have to know what happened to her," he murmured to himself. The next day, Okubi decided to return to his hometown. He arrived in an expensive car, his presence immediately drawing the attention of the villagers. Whispers filled the air as they marveled at the man who had left years ago and returned in such grandeur. Before anything else, Okubi went straight to his family's home. His parents were surprised but delighted to see him after such a long absence. After exchanging pleasantries, he sat them down, his face serious. "There's something I need to confess," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. "Back in school, I got a girl pregnant, Senam. She was my first love. I denied the pregnancy and I abandoned her. I've carried this guilt for years, and now I need to make it right." His parents were stunned. His father, a man of great pride, looked away in shame. His mother placed a trembling hand over her mouth. "Okubi, why didn't you tell us back then?" she asked. "I was scared," he admitted, "but I need to find her now. I need to know what happened." His parents, embarrassed by their son's actions, agreed to help him. Together, they went to Senam's family home to seek forgiveness. When the family arrived at Senam's house, she was sitting outside, peeling cassava. Her mother was nearby, tending to a small fire. They both looked up as the car approached, puzzled by the sight of the unfamiliar vehicle. Okubi stepped out, followed by his parents and a few other relatives. Senam stared at him, unrecognizing at first. But as he approached, Something about his face stirred memories she had tried to bury. "Senam," he said softly, his voice breaking. Her hands froze, the cassava falling to the ground. Tears welled up in her eyes as recognition dawned. "Okubi," she whispered, her voice trembling. Years of pain came rushing back to her. She covered her face and wept, her body shaking with emotion. Okubi stood there, guilt etched deeply into his face. His parents looked on helplessly, unsure of what to say or do. Okubi's parents finally stepped forward. His mother spoke first, her voice filled with regret. "We're here to say we're sorry, Senam, and to your mother. We failed you both. We should have accepted the pregnancy back then, but instead, we let you suffer alone. Please, forgive us." Senam's mother, who had harbored years of bitterness, remained silent for a moment before speaking. "Your actions caused my daughter so much pain. Pain that no apology can erase. But if Senam chooses to forgive, so will I." As Senam's tears subsided, she looked directly at Okubi, her face a mix of anger and bitterness. Her voice was sharp as she asked, "So, you're here for your child, right? Is that why you came back after all these years?" Okubi opened his mouth to respond, but she didn't give him a chance. "I cursed you," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I cursed you that you will never have a child, and it's clear that my words have come true. That's why you're here, isn't it? Because the curse is working against you, and you've realized that you need me to lift it." Okubi stood there in silence, his head bowed, unable to meet her eyes. Senam continued, her voice rising. "It's good that all your parents are alive to witness this day. Back then they trusted you, they believed in your lies, and now you're here, dragging them along to beg for what? Redemption? Forgiveness." His parents looked away, ashamed, as Senam's words cut deep into their pride. Hours passed as the families continued their conversations. Okubi and his parents pleaded for forgiveness, their voices filled with regret. Senam sat quietly, listening, her heart battling between anger and a small sense of relief that finally they acknowledged her pain. At last, Senam took a deep breath and said, "I forgive you, Okubi, not for your sake, but for my own peace. But there's nothing left to save. The child you abandoned is dead. He didn't survive in Accra." Her words were firm, but deep inside, her heart ached as she remembered the moment she had left her son at the gate of the mansion. She had buried that secret for years, and now it felt heavier than ever. Okubi, though devastated, reached into his bag and pulled out an envelope filled with money. He handed it to Senam, his voice trembling. "This is for you. I know it can't erase what happened, but it's a start. And if the child were alive, I would build you a house and give you a better life. I swear it." Senam's hand shook as she took the envelope, staring at the thick wad of cash inside. For a moment she considered revealing the truth, but fear and doubt held her back. Later that evening, Senam and her mother sat in the small room they shared, the flickering light from a kerosene lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Senam's mother broke the silence. "Senam," she began hesitantly, "if the child is alive, you need to tell Okubi the truth. He's a wealthy man now. He could change your destiny, and the child's." Senam's eyes flashed with anger. "My destiny? You're talking about my destiny now?" she said, her voice trembling. "Where were you when I was suffering with that child? Where were you when I begged for food and scraped for every coin to keep him alive? You abandoned me, just like Okubi did. And now, after all these years, you're looking for a destiny changer. You should have thought about my destiny back then." Her mother's face fell, tears filling her eyes. "I was wrong, Senam," she whispered. "I made mistakes, and I let my anger and pride blind me to your suffering. But I'm begging you now, don't let your pain hold you back. You've carried this burden for too long. Forgive me, forgive yourself, and let's move forward. Please." Senam stared at her mother, the bitterness she had held on to for years threatening to consume her. But as she looked into her mother's tearful eyes, she saw genuine remorse. "I'll think about it," she said softly, her voice weary. The room fell silent, the weight of their conversation lingering like a shadow. For the first time in years, Senam allowed herself to hope, not just for forgiveness, but for the possibility of a better future. Senam lay awake that night, replaying the events of the day in her mind, the promise of a better life, the possibility of a brighter future, and the heartfelt apology from Okubi and his family stirred something in her. For years, she had suffered silently, carrying the weight of rejection and hardship. But now, the idea of a new beginning, one where her struggles could finally end, began to take root in her heart. After days of contemplation, Senam made a decision. She would take a chance on this unexpected opportunity. Her pain and pride had guided her for too long, and perhaps it was time to embrace forgiveness and allow herself to dream again. The next morning, Senam received an unexpected call from Okubi. His voice was calm, but filled with an undertone of hope. "Senam," he began, "I've been thinking. We've both been through so much over the years. We've both had our struggles, but maybe this is the time to come together again. Neither of us is married, and I believe we can make things work." Senam was silent, trying to process his words. "Senam," Okubi continued, as the Akan proverb says, "Jarintia, dada dir nisor inyar sorna," meaning, a rekindled fire burns brighter than a new one. Maybe we were meant to find each other again after all these years. I believe that reuniting with you will not only bring peace to my life, but may also bring my son back, if he's alive. His words struck a chord in Senam. She had spent years running from her past, but here was a man who was willing to confront it, to make amends and start anew. Convinced by Okubi's sincerity and the possibility of a better life, Senam decided to visit him in Accra. It had been years since she last set foot in the city, and her heart was heavy with both anxiety and anticipation. When she arrived, Okubi welcomed her warmly. His once proud and cold demeanor had softened, replaced by a man humbled by his mistakes and eager to make amends. "I believe our son is alive, Senam," he said during their conversation. "I feel it deep in my heart, and I believe that if we rebuild what we lost, we can find him and bring him back into our lives." Senam listened, her emotions a mix of hope and fear. Could it be true? Could their son still be alive? And if he was, what would that mean for her, and for the family who might have raised him? Senam couldn't shake the memory of the house number she had noted the night she left her son at the mansion gate in East Legon. The guilt and longing had consumed her for years, but now, living in Accra with Okubi, she decided to act on her lingering hope. Whenever Okubi went to work, Senam would board a car and head to East Legon, her heart pounding as she approached the area. She lingered near the house, watching, waiting for a glimpse of the boy she had left behind. Over time, she pieced together small details about the household. She learned that the boy she left, now named Abuaji Nyamichair, had grown into a fine young man and become a successful medical doctor. Tragically, she also discovered that his father, Mr. Abuaje, had passed away 2 months earlier, leaving his widow, Mrs. Abuaje, in deep mourning. One fateful afternoon, as Senam waited near the house, she saw a tall, well-dressed young man entering the gate. Her heart raced, her legs trembling as she recognized him immediately. She waited for the gate to open fully, then rushed forward, calling out to him. "Please, young man, I need to speak with you," she said desperately. Nyamichair, startled by the sudden intrusion, turned to face her. His expression was confused but kind. "Who are you, madam?" he asked. "Please," Senam said, her voice trembling. "I need just a moment of your time. Can we speak privately?" Nyamichair hesitated but nodded. He led her to a quiet corner of the compound, curious yet wary. "What is it?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. Senam's hands shook as she began. "What is your name?" He looked at her, puzzled. "I'm Dr. Nyamichair Abuaje," he said. Her breath hitched. "Do you have a mark on your back?" Nyamichair's eyes widened slightly. "Yes," he said cautiously. Senam pointed to the exact spot. "Here, just below your left shoulder blade," she said. Nyamichair's mouth fell open in shock. How? How do you know that? Who are you?" Tears streamed down Senam's face as she said, "You're my son. I gave birth to you years ago. When you were just a baby, I took you to the market. You started crying, and a kind woman, Mrs. Abuaje, offered to help me carry you while I shopped. But as I turned to follow her, I lost sight of her. She disappeared with you. I've been searching for you ever since." Nyamichair's face was a mixture of shock, confusion, and disbelief. "How did you find me?" he asked, his voice trembling. "And why are you only showing up now, after all these years?" Senam hesitated, her mind racing. She couldn't reveal the truth about abandoning him at the gate. Instead, she lied. "I was in this area some time ago and saw you by chance. Your face, it looks so much like your biological father. That's when I knew you were my son." Her voice broke as she began to cry bitterly. "I never stopped looking for you, Nyamichair. Not for one moment. I have prayed every day, searched every place I could think of, hoping to find you." Nyamichair stood frozen, overwhelmed by the flood of emotions and information. He struggled to process the idea that the woman before him might be his biological mother. The mark on his back, her tears, her story, it all seemed too real to ignore. "Why didn't you go to the police or report it?" he asked, his voice laced with pain and suspicion. "I tried," Senam lied again, her sobs choking her words. "But I had nothing. No money, no resources. I was poor and alone. All I had was my love for you, and it has never faded. Please, my son, believe me." Nyamichair's heart ached at the sight of her grief, but questions lingered in his mind. Was she truly his mother? If so, why had she waited until now to find him? And what would this revelation mean for the life he had built with Mrs. Abuaje, the woman he had known as his mother? A few days after their emotional first meeting, Nyamichair called Senam. His voice was steady, but she could sense the turmoil beneath it. "Madame," he said, still hesitant to address her as his mother, "I'd like us to meet again. There's someone I want to meet with you." Senam's heart raced. She knew this moment would come. "Of course, my son," she replied, her voice trembling. When they met, Nyamichair told her, "You mentioned my biological father. I want to meet him too." The meeting was arranged, and when Nyamichair finally stood face to face with Okubi, he felt his legs weaken. The resemblance was undeniable. Looking into Okubi's face was like staring into a mirror of his own future.
"Why now?"
Nyamiche asked, his voice trembling.
"Why are you coming into my life only after all these years?"
Okubi, prepared for the question, repeated the story Senam had told.
"I never stopped searching for you, son. Your mother and I were separated from you by circumstances we couldn't control. I didn't even know where you were until recently."
Nyamechia's eyes filled with tears. The reunion was bittersweet, a mix of sadness, disbelief, and longing.
"I want to know the truth," Nyamechia said firmly. "We'll settle this with DNA tests."
Both Senam and Okubi agreed, and samples were taken that same day. Weeks later, the DNA results confirmed what Nyamechia had suspected. Senam and Okubi were indeed his biological parents. The news hit him like a thunderbolt. Despite their resemblance and the emotional stories they'd told, he hadn't fully prepared himself for the reality. The confirmation forced him to reevaluate everything he thought he knew about his life. The woman who had raised him, who had given him love and the best opportunities in life, suddenly seemed like a stranger. "How could Mrs. Aboage steal me from my parents?" Nyamechia thought bitterly. His heart twisted with anger and betrayal. He remembered all the times he had sat by her side, thinking she was his real mother, never questioning her love or intentions, distancing himself from Mrs. Aboage. Nyamechia's emotions consumed him. Although he never directly confronted Mrs. Aboage, he couldn't bear to look at her the same way. In his mind, she had taken him from his biological parents, depriving them of the chance to raise him. He began avoiding her entirely, declining her calls and making excuses to stay away. Instead, he spent most of his days with Senam and Okubi, finding comfort in the connection he believed had been stolen from him. Mrs. Aboage, who had already been grieving the loss of her husband, was devastated by Nyamechia's absence. She tried everything to reach him, sending messages, calling, and even visiting his workplace, but he remained distant and cold. She sat alone in their grand home, staring at old photos of Nyamechia as a child, tears streaming down her face. "I raised him. I gave him everything. How can he abandon me like this?" she whispered to herself. The pain of rejection weighed heavily on Mrs. Aboage. She had always known there was a possibility that Nyamechia's biological parents might come back into his life, but she never imagined it would cost her the bond they shared. She often sat in silence, her phone in hand, hoping he would call. Days turned into weeks, and the silence grew louder. Nyamechia, meanwhile, struggled with his own emotions. Though he didn't confront Mrs. Aboage, he couldn't forgive her in his heart. The thought of facing her felt like reopening wounds that were too painful to bear. While Nyamechia grew closer to Senam and Okubi, he couldn't shake the memories of the woman who had raised him. She had been there through every step of his life, cheering him on, guiding him, and shaping him into the man he had become. Yet his anger blinded him to her sacrifices. Mrs. Aboage's sorrow deepened with each passing day as her beloved son distanced himself further. Her once lively home became a place of loneliness and grief. Okubi, overjoyed at finally reconnecting with his son, began making plans to proudly introduce Nyamechia to his extended family in their hometown. For years he had carried the stigma of being childless, and now he wanted the world to know that he had a son, a successful medical doctor. "Nyamechia," Okubi said one evening, "I want to take you to our hometown. Let everyone know that I'm your father and you're my son. It's time to reclaim what was lost." Nyamechia, however, was hesitant.
"I appreciate your enthusiasm, but I need time to process everything," he replied. "I'll visit when I'm ready. For now, I need to learn more about where I come from." Senam had already told him bits and pieces about their hometown, and Okubi had proudly shared their family background and lineage. Still, Nyamachir wanted the full picture before taking such a big step. Curious and suspicious, Nyamachir hired a private investigator to visit his parents' hometown and uncover the truth about their past. He wanted to understand the circumstances that had led to his abandonment. A month later, the investigator returned with detailed findings. The reports painted a painful picture of betrayal and neglect. The more Nyamachir read, the angrier he became. The people who now claimed to be his loving parents had once abandoned him at his most vulnerable. One evening, Nyamachir returned to Senam's house, his emotions boiling over. "Mother," he said coldly, "I need you to explain something to me. Why did you leave me when I was sick and dying? Why didn't you fight harder to keep me alive?" Senam froze, her hands trembling. Tears filled her eyes as she replied, "Nyamachir, Don't lie to me," he interrupted. "I know everything. I know how my father abandoned you. I know how grandmother turned her back on you. But why did you abandon me too? You had a choice, and you left me to my fate." Senam broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. "You don't understand, my son. I had nothing. No money, no food, no support. I begged, I worked, I prayed, but it wasn't enough. You were so sick, and I couldn't bear to watch you die in my arms. Leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I thought it was the only way to save you." Her voice cracked as she continued, "I never stopped thinking about you. Every day, I wondered if you were alive, if someone had cared for you. I wanted to come back for you, but by then, I had no idea where to start." Nyamachir listened, his heart torn between anger and pity. Her tears were genuine, but the pain of abandonment was too deep to ignore. Days later, Nyamachir turned his attention to Okubi. They met at a quiet spot where he wasted no time. "You knew my mother was pregnant, and you abandoned her," Nyamachir said, his voice sharp. "You left her to suffer alone with no support. How do you justify that?" Okubi sighed deeply, guilt etched into his face. "I was a coward," he admitted. "I was young, foolish, and afraid of responsibility. I thought denying the pregnancy would make it go away. I was wrong, Nyamachir. I've regretted that decision every day of my life." "Regret doesn't change anything," Nyamachir said bitterly. "Your cowardice cost me and my mother everything. Do you have any idea what she went through, what I went through?" "I'm sorry," Okubi said softly, his eyes pleading. "I know I failed you. I can't change the past, but I want to be part of your future. Please, give me a chance." Nyamachir shook his head. "I can't forgive you. Not yet. Maybe not ever." The revelations weighed heavily on Nyamachir. He couldn't bring himself to forgive his father, and while he sympathized with his mother's struggles, the hurt lingered. He distanced himself from both Senam and Okubi, spending his time alone, trying to process the painful truths of his past. Nyamachir sat alone one evening, reflecting on the decisions he had made in the whirlwind of discovering his biological parents. His heart ached with guilt as he thought about Mrs. Aboje, the woman who had saved his life, sacrificed her wealth, and raised him as her own. Despite her unwavering love and support, he had turned away from her, consumed by anger and confusion after learning about his biological parents.
What hurt the most was how Senam and Okubi, his biological parents, had accused Mrs. Aboaje of stealing him. Deep down, Nyamechir knew the truth. Mrs. Aboaje hadn't stolen him, but had saved him from certain death. Yet, in his frustration and quest for answers, he had allowed the accusations to cloud his judgment and had wrongfully rejected her. He decided he needed to make amends, but resolved to keep the truth about his biological parents hidden from her. He couldn't bear to hurt the woman who had given him everything. One evening, Nyamechir returned to the grand house he had once avoided. Mrs. Aboaje, sitting alone in the living room, was surprised to see him walk in. Her eyes lit up with cautious hope. "Nyamechir," she said softly. "Mother," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. "I'm sorry. I've been distant and I know I've hurt you. I want you to know it wasn't about you. I've been battling a broken heart from a recent relationship, and I let that cloud my actions." Mrs. Aboaje's face softened as she listened. "Oh, my son," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "I thought I'd lost you. I was so worried that maybe you had found something or someone else. But I'm just glad you're here now." Nyamechir hugged her tightly, feeling the weight of his guilt ease slightly. He vowed to never let her feel abandoned again. 2 months later, Nyamechir suggested they travel abroad together for a fresh start. "Mother," he said, "you've worked so hard all your life. Let's leave everything behind for a while. I want to show you the world and give you the rest and happiness you deserve." Mrs. Aboaje hesitated, but eventually agreed, touched by her son's gesture. What she didn't know was that Nyamechir had another reason for the move, to sever ties with his biological parents, especially his father, Okubi. While abroad, Nyamechir completely ignored his father. Despite numerous calls and messages from Okubi, he refused to respond. He couldn't forgive the man who had abandoned both him and his mother in their time of need. However, he maintained a steady connection with Senam, speaking to her regularly on the phone. He decided to regard Senam as his biological mother out of compassion. She was old, and he didn't want to hurt her health by revealing his anger toward Okubi or his true feelings about their past. For her, he showed care and support, ensuring she never felt neglected. Back in Ghana, Senam's relationship with Okubi grew increasingly strained. Their differences and unresolved tensions made it impossible for them to coexist peacefully. During one of their calls, Nyamechir told Senam, "If you need my support, you don't have to stay with him. I can help you live a better life on your own." Encouraged by her son's words, Senam finally decided to leave Okubi. She packed her belongings and moved out, leaving behind the man who had once abandoned her and her son. To her surprise, Nyamechir gifted her a luxurious mansion in Accra, ensuring she had a comfortable and independent life. "You've been through enough, Mother," he told her. "This is my way of thanking you for all that you endured." Throughout this time, Nyamechir kept the truth hidden from Mrs. Aboaje. He continued to treat her as his only mother, showering her with love and gratitude. To her, he was the devoted son she had always known, and she was relieved to believe that whatever had caused their brief rift had been resolved. As Nyamechir balanced the relationships between his two mothers, he found a way to honor the sacrifices of both women while silently carrying the weight of their complicated pasts. Yet the unresolved pain between him and Okubi lingered, a reminder of the choices and consequences that had shaped their lives. Okubi lived the rest of his life with an unbearable weight of regret and sorrow. Despite his wealth and success, happiness remained elusive. He had everything: cars, houses, and a thriving business. but none of it could fill the emptiness in his heart. The knowledge that he had a son, Nyamachir, brought him some comfort, but his son's rejection was a constant reminder of the mistakes he had made. Okubi had longed to introduce Nyamachir to his friends and family, to prove to the world that he wasn't impotent as many had whispered over the years. Yet Nyamachir never presented himself, refusing to visit Okubi's family or acknowledge him publicly. Each day, Okubi was haunted by the scars of his past, scars that no amount of time, money, or apologies could erase. Meanwhile, Nyamachir had built a beautiful life abroad. 7 years after leaving Ghana, he was happily married to a Ghanaian woman, and they had 2 children, a boy and a girl. His son was the spitting image of him, while his daughter had her mother's charm and intelligence. The birth of his children brought immense joy to his life, and his happiness radiated in everything he did. Mrs. Agnes, his adoptive mother, was overjoyed to be a grandmother. She often spent hours with the children, reading to them, playing, and sharing stories of her and her late husband's life. For Nyamachir, his adoptive mother's happiness became a source of comfort, even as he continued to distance himself from his biological father. 7 years later, Mrs. Agnes's health began to decline. She grew weak and was admitted to the hospital. One quiet evening, as she lay in her hospital bed, she called Nyamachir to her side. Her face was frail, but her eyes were filled with love. "Nyamachir," she began softly, her voice trembling, "there's something I need to tell you before I leave this world. You are not my biological son." Nyamachir sat in stunned silence as she continued, "We found you at our gate. You were just a baby, sick and crying. Your father and I took you in and reported you to the police, but no one ever came for you. We named you Nyamachir because we believed God had given us a gift, a child we couldn't have on our own. You brought us so much happiness. You were our everything." Tears streamed down her face as she spoke. "We always hoped one day you might find your real parents if they were still alive. But even if you never did, you were our son in every way that mattered. Raising you was the greatest blessing of our lives." Nyamachir's heart broke as he listened. He took her frail hand in his and said, "You are my mother. You and father are my only parents. Without you, I wouldn't be who I am today." He chose not to tell her about Senam or Okubi, knowing that revealing the truth might disturb her peace in her final days. A month later, Mrs. Agnes passed away peacefully, surrounded by love. After her death, Nyamachir decided to return to Ghana for the first time in years. He brought his wife and children with him, determined to give Mrs. Agnes the proper burial she deserved in her homeland. The funeral was grand, a testament to the love and respect he had for her. Following the burial, Nyamachir reunited with his biological mother, Senam. Their bond had grown stronger over the years, and she was overjoyed to see him again, this time with his wife and children. However, his feelings toward Okubi hadn't changed. He still refused to acknowledge his father, holding on to the pain of abandonment that he couldn't forgive. One day, Nyamachir and Senam traveled to their hometown together. The village was abuzz with whispers as people saw Senam, once the girl who had been shamed and abandoned, returning with a successful son. "Is that Senam?" one villager asked in disbelief. "Yes, it's her," another replied. "And that's her son, a doctor. Can you imagine?" Senam held her head high, tears of pride in her eyes as she walked beside Nyamachir. For years, she had endured rejection and hardship, but now she stood as a testament to resilience and perseverance.
Nyamichir's presence in the village marked a moment of redemption for Senam. As the villagers gathered around to greet them, she introduced her son with pride, saying, "This is my son, Nyamichir, the boy I once thought I had lost. God brought him back to me, and I am blessed." While Senam basked in the joy of her son's success, Nyamichir remained conflicted. He had honored his adoptive mother's memory, reconnected with his biological mother, and built a beautiful family. Yet the scars of his past and his unresolved relationship with Okubi lingered in his heart. As he stood in the village, surrounded by people celebrating his and Senam's journey, he silently wondered if he could ever find true closure. 2 years after Nyamichir's return to Ghana, Okubi passed away. His final years were marked by overwhelming sadness, regret, and sorrow. Despite his wealth and status, he died a lonely man, never experiencing the happiness of a true father-son relationship. Nyamichir's rejection had been the ultimate reminder of his past mistakes. The abandonment of his pregnant girlfriend, his denial of his child, and the years he spent running from his responsibilities. In the eyes of his community, Okubi was still seen as an irresponsible and impotent man. Though the truth of Nyamichir's paternity was known to a few, he never received the public acknowledgement he desperately craved. His wealth and success could not shield him from the consequences of his actions, and he carried the weight of his choices to his grave. Advice to men: to every man listening to this story, never run away from your responsibilities. A child is a blessing, and denying that blessing can bring lifelong consequences. To men who abandon their women and children, remember that the law of karma exists. What goes up will surely come down. Your actions today can determine your future. Face your responsibilities with courage and integrity, and give your children the love and support they deserve. Advice to women: to every woman struggling to raise her children alone, you are the backbone of your child's future. Be bold, be strong, and stand firm for your children. Do not abandon them to their fate, no matter how hard life becomes. Your sacrifices will one day be rewarded. Your resilience is unmatched, and your love can shape your child's destiny. Blessing to families who adopt. To families who take in children that are not their own, may you be blessed abundantly. Your kindness and love are priceless gifts to the world. Like Mrs. Agnes and her husband, you give children a chance to thrive and create a future filled with hope and joy. The world needs more people like you. Advice to children: learn to forgive and forget. Life is too short to hold on to pain and resentment. No parent is perfect, but their love, in whatever form it takes, is a part of your journey. Forgiving others can set you free and help you live a more fulfilling life. What do you think about this story? Do you support Nyamichir for abandoning his father and embracing his mother? Or do you think he should have forgiven his father? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your opinions in the comments below. Don't forget to like, comment, and share this video to spread its lessons far and wide. If you haven't already, subscribe to Anansi Web of Tales for more captivating and moral stories like this one. Let us know where you're watching from, and thank you for your continued support. See you in our next video.